I'm Sean Evans, and you're watching Hot Ones. It's the show with hot questions and even hotter wings. And today we're joined by Quavo. He's a rapper, songwriter, and record producer. You know, as one-third of the rap group Migos. His latest single, Straightening, is out now with the group's upcoming fourth studio album, Culture 3, set to release on June 11th. Quavo, welcome to the show.
What's happening? What's happening?
How are you around spicy food? Are you a man who enjoys his hot sauce?
I like a little bit of hot sauce. Only on fish, though.
Well, today, we're taking on chicken. Are you ready to get started?
Let's do it.
To it, really. What does the word mean to you?
We feel like we lead by example, and we gave them the flow that everybody using and everybody creating new flows off of that flow. We the foundation, so we the culture, we the bricks that are starting all this new music right now. I like all flats, just 50%.
So we can't have a Quavo interview without a deep dive in your personal style, which has been highlighted on GQ's Best Dressed Man of the Week more often than I can count.
Yeah.
Do you remember running into Jeff Goldblum at Yves Saint Laurent a few years ago? He talked about it during his hour.
Yeah, man. Every time I see him, though, he's super fresh. Just seen him at the Clippers game, and he just super fresh every time I see him. And I was like, what it is? And they told me, I was like, oh, it makes sense. It makes sense for me. Yeah. The drip is crazy. Yeah, outside.
I see what you're saying there. I see what you're saying there.
So, and it was like, I grabbed the sheet. It was like a air sheet with whole like money signs and coins and shit. I nailed that shit in the back. And then when I nailed it in the back, we used to shoot videos in front of it and just rap all day. Takeoff. The reason why his name Takeoff, because he used to do everything in one take. Movie making, you had to like record one pass. Anybody mess up in one ad lib, anything, you had to start it all the way over. That's how Takeoff got one take, because he'll do his whole verse and not mess up, and will mess up and have to start him over.
How did that translate at school? Like, did making music at that age, did that endear you to the kids more? Did it make you more popular at school, or what effect did the music have there?
Everybody kind of laughed at me.
Yeah.
They kind of laughed at me, passing out the CD with me and Takeoff on the songs, and then that day, all shit was like, they just put so much time and effort in these days, and something it's like a big grand finale, but I felt like it was something I wanted to be. I wanted to perform it because I think I was the first rapper to ever perform it. And next thing you know, I started like learning about it. And then Lil Farrell come out with a new beat.
Yeah.
I was like, damn, I was there, so I feel like I need to be a part of it. Be one of the greatest musicians ever. And I was on stage with one of them.
All right, this next one. Do you have a favorite memory or favorite game from the handful that you've watched from the sidelines with the Georgia Bulldogs?
Gotta be that one. Gotta be that game right there. That's when we took it home, won the SEC championship, and we went on and got the Rose Bowl, beat Baker Mayfield, then we lost a tough one in Alabama. But I was there the whole step of the way, and I feel like the boys was rocking out. But got to be DJ Khaled. It was fine. I can't really speak because my tongue is on fire.
That's the show, yeah. That's the show.
So he had, I can't talk, bro. Like, for real. So, he just looking legit, a house, he had tons of food, table, super long, just whatever food you could imagine. We sat out there, we ate really good. After we ate, went to the studio and made a smash, go crazy with her. And I just feel like that was the craziest vibe, and it was a big hit.
Was that the same session that he was blasting off the air horn?
Yeah, hey. Help me out, because I can't really talk. How to give me a fork?
Oh, that's smart. Grab a fork. Alright. This one is Love Burns from Hotter Than Hell. Try your way. So athletes often use music for inspiration. I know this puts you on the spot, but what do you think is the best Migos song for a locker room anthem before the big game?
Ice Trade Game. Ice Trade, Trey Young. right now when we get to the back. And then gotta be straightening. Not get straightening, but straightening. Gotta handle your business.
All right, so Quavo, here we are, thankfully, mercifully, at the end of our spicy wing journey together. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not, but a few years ago, Offset came in and provided some of the biggest spice highlights that we had in all of season 8. So what I want to do is show you some of these highlights, some of these gifts, widely circulated on the internet. As someone who knows him best, I'm just curious what you think his internal dialogue is, okay? Handle that. Alright, up next. Chicken Wing, the show that made eating the hottest sauces known to man a global sensation, becomes a collaboration for the ages. The Oxford Pennant Hot Ones collection is Spice Lord approved and Sean Evans certified. Your favorite Hot Ones systems are immortalized in a series of pennants, camp flags, banners, and pins. Fully designed and manufactured in my hometown, the spiciest city in America, Buffalo, New York. If there's one thing I love about Buffalo, it's that it's given you such national treasures as the Chicken Wing, the Buffalo Bills, Tony Soprano's mom, Rick James, Camera Guy Bill, and the hottest collaboration of the year. Get yours today at shop.firstweekfeast.com. That's shop.firstweekfeast.com. Happy Flag Day.
Show's episodes have notoriously been made in just 6 days, each and every episode. But I actually think that what's more interesting than how South Park is made is how that process changes the show. In South Park's 6-day done process, the very way it's created is the reason the final product works after 20 years. Let me explain.
Don't post that. Do not post that.
I'm going to do it anyways. Pre-serialization. Parker and the writer sit down and start the script. The script they have to finish in just days' time. The episode will air in 1 week. I think the first thing this does for the show is keep it honest. Part of the reason we've seen such a huge rise in reaction content on platforms like YouTube is because, when done well, it's a moment of both the writers and Trey can constantly censor themselves. They don't have time for the jokes stick when they hit. But more importantly, it's harder for the network to censor them. If they try to force the team to make changes, they miss their internet. Fans are mad, and the network may lose money and ratings. And it has happened. But that short turnaround time forces Comedy Central to be very careful about what they would do. And this means, more often than not, South Park gets away with a lot more than it would if the network had months to force changes to the episodes. Episode 200 and 201 are a rare example of Comedy Central really stepping in and trying to create change, but instead, it actually drove home the joke. But I think the biggest benefit to the way that this show is created is conscious. Almost always, the best shows are the ones that come on the idea. The episodes where you walk in the office and meet them there and still have no idea what the episode is about. That's what Parker would tell CNN shortly after the show won its first Peabody Award for its social commentary. There's a tape in the South Park office, a tape where a group of people Parker and sit every Thursday and try to figure out what it is they have. Serialized or not, is still a towel impersonating a human while it fights off Oprah's arguing war. It still has the same goals, it still wants the same things, it still accomplishes them in the same ways. To make you laugh by making you think even when it's uncomfortable, maybe, just maybe, you'll actually get a better understanding of
And it's gone. It's gone. It's all gone.
Poof! That is it for today's episode of Nostalgic. If you enjoyed this video, press that like button down below. As always, if you haven't yet done so, press subscribe. That way you don't miss anything I put out on this channel. Also, that little bell that says subscribe button, that notification bell, just make sure you're actually notified when I upload something on that bell. As well, as always, I just remind you Nostalgic. To see expect our next on the show.
This music was born out of an obsession for performance. Carefully put science and purpose behind their design choices and built absolutely terrific products as a result. Glasses are amazing. I love them because they look great, They are super comfortable, and the optical clarity is incredible. They filter out sunlight in a way that still allows you to see contrast and shadows the way you need to. For me, one of the things that's really irritating is if I have a pair of sunglasses, it doesn't allow me to see all the things I want to see. And with Roka glasses, I get incredible contrast, but then I can also relax and be outdoors in bright light. And as the amount of light changes with cloud cover and things of that sort, my ability to see my surroundings is still really sharp and really clear. That only comes from really understanding how the visual system works and how it adjusts to contrast and adaptation and all these different things. They really understand the science, and that went into the design of these glasses. And as many of you know, sunlight and the viewing of light is also very important for setting circadian rhythms. So that's also incorporated into the design and science behind these glasses. I do wear readers. I don't know if you wear them during the podcast, but I have to wear reading glasses at night. So I use their readers, and I own a pair of their sunglasses, and I'm delighted with them. If you'd like to check out Roka, the glasses, you can go to roka.com. That's ROKA.com. Learning. We talked about how to learn skills faster. Whether or not those are skills for athletic performance, dance, music, things of that sort. We've also talked about how to gain strength and how to lose fat faster by leveraging the nervous system. Things like shiver and non-shiver, non-exercise activity-induced thermogenesis, about how neurons can actually trigger accelerated fat loss. We talked about hypertrophy, also about muscle growth, and we covered everything from sets and reps, protocols, how long to stay in a cold ice bath, when to get out, how to keep shivering. We covered a lot of tools and a lot of science. So if you're interested in those things and perhaps want to learn a little bit about how we make energy, ATP, from carbohydrates and fats, it's all covered in the previous 4 episodes. This was going to be the time that we move to a new topic entirely, but we are going to do one more episode in this series on physical performance. The simple reason that you asked many questions about something that's vitally important both for physical performance and long-term and short-term health, and that's endurance. So today we are going to talk about endurance. Now, if you're a strength athlete or you're not interested in endurance, don't depart just yet, because it turns out that there are ways to train endurance that are but it's really interesting because not only is hydration a limiting factor on performance, but there is a right way to hydrate and there is a wrong way to hydrate. There actually is a formula that I'll teach you to know how much water to be drinking, depending on your activity levels. And that sounds like a simple thing, like, oh, just, tap off water until your urine runs clear. That's actually the wrong advice. It turns out that if you don't hydrate properly, you can see 20 to 30% reductions in performance, whether or not that's strength, whether or not that's increasing hypertrophy, whether or not that's running, swimming, even mental performance. So even if you're not an athlete or a recreational athlete at all, I encourage you to stay tuned for the part of nutrition. We're going to cover, as usual, a little bit of science, and then we're going to dive right into protocols that you can apply for overall health, and that includes our training. And then describe the reasons for that and the mechanisms that work for themselves. Today I'd like to talk about endurance, how to build endurance, and how to use endurance for the health of your entire body. Endurance, as the name suggests, is our ability to engage in continuous bouts of exercise, or continuous movement, or continuous effort of any kind. And I do believe that our ability to engage in activities that we call endurance training, or physical endurance activities, do have carryover to mental performance of things that require long-term effort. Touch on that at the end and why there's reason to believe that there's a biological crossover between those two things. I don't think it's simply the case that if you train yourself to be a strength and speed athlete and do short bouts of exercise that are very intense, to convert lots of things into ATP. We can convert carbohydrates, literally the kinds of carbohydrates. You eat a bagel, you eat a piece of pizza. Pizza usually is dough and it has cheese and some other things. Costello here, I'll tell you what, Costello loves pizza. Eating a piece of pizza, it gets converted into various things, fatty acids from the fats, glucose from the bread, and those things get converted into ATP within cells through things like glycolysis, things like lipolysis. I talked about this in previous episodes. So our muscles and our neurons use different fuel sources to generate ATP. The ones that are used first for short bouts of intense activity are things like phosphocreatine. If you've only heard about creatine as a supplement, well, phosphocreatine actually exists in our muscles, and that's why people take creatine. You load your muscles with more creatine, and phosphocreatine is great for short, intense bouts of effort. So really pushing hard on something physical. Let's say you see a car on the side of the road, and that car is stalled, and the person says, "Hey, can you help me push my car?" And you start to push. It's going to be phosphocreatine is going to be a motivation and fuel use, motivation and fuel allocation. And we are going to talk about specific training protocols that you can follow that have carryover between the bodily systems of running, swimming, etc., and the way that your brain works. So let's talk about endurance by asking first, what are the limiting factors on endurance? What stops us? Because in addressing that and answering that, we will understand what allows us to get into effort and to continue effort. There are 5 main categories of things that allow us to engage in effort. And they are neurons, nerves, muscle, blood, things in our blood, our heart, and our lungs. I don't want to completely write off things like the immune system and other systems of the body, but nerve, muscle, blood, heart, and lungs are the 5 that I want to focus on today because that's where most of the data are.
The world is reopening. It's time to make up for lost time. Little smiles, small wins, they all make a big difference. At Solgar, we focus on the little things that make a big difference to you. Solgar, the little big difference.
Environment that's going to make it very clear why quitting is a mental thing, not a physical thing. So why do we quit? Well, an experiment was done a couple of years ago. It was published in the journal Cell Press Journal, excellent journal, showing that there is a class of neurons in our brainstem, in the back of our brain, that if they shut off, we quit. Now, these neurons release epinephrine. Epinephrine is adrenaline. And anytime we are engaged in effort of any kind, we are releasing epinephrine. Anytime we're awake, really, we are releasing epinephrine into our brain. In fact, this little group of neurons in the back of our brain is called the locus ceruleus, if you like, is churning out epinephrine all the time. But if something stresses us out, it churns out more, and then it acts as kind of an alertness signal for the whole brain. We also, of course, have adrenaline epinephrine released in our body, which makes our body ready. So think about epinephrine as a readiness signal. And when we are engaged in effort, this readiness signal is being churned into our epinephrine. It's like I quit, that's it, no more effort signal. If they could extend the time before those glia said, enough, if they could release more adrenaline into the system, then subjects would keep going. So our desire to continue, or put differently, our willingness to continue and our desire to quit is mediated by events between our 2 ears. Now that doesn't mean that the body's not involved, but it means that neurons are critically important. So we have 2 categories of neurons that are important. The ones in our head that tell us, get up and go out and take that run, and the ones that allow us, encourage us to continue that run, and we have neurons that shut things off and say no more. And we, of course, have the neurons that connect to our muscles and control our muscles. But the reason we quit is rarely because our body quits, our mind quits. Now, we never want to encourage people to drive themselves to the point of injury. That's not going to be good for anybody, but it is good to know that it's an entire lecture about the action potential, but basically, in order to get nerve cells to fire, to contract muscle, to say, I'm going to continue, you need sufficient sodium, salt, because the action potential, the actual firing of neurons, is driven by sodium entering the cell, rushing into the cell, and then there's a removal of potassium, and then there's a kind of resetting of those levels. by something called the sodium-potassium pump. And the sodium-potassium pump and sodium and action potentials, even if you don't know anything about that, is ATP dependent. It requires energy. So you need energy in order to get neurons to fire. And it is pH dependent. It depends on the conditions or the environment within the brain being of a certain pH or acidity. pH is about how acid or how basic the environment is. We will talk a little bit about pH in simple terms that you can understand. So nerves need salt, they need potassium, and it turns out they need magnesium, and you need glucose and carbohydrates in order to power those neurons unless you are running on ketones. And to run on ketones, you have to make sure that you're fully keto adapted. I will talk about adding in ketones on top of carbohydrate at the end of the episode. Okay, so that's how nerves work. You need carbohydrate, you need sodium, potassium, and magnesium in order to drive the brain. Episode if you want to learn more about that, but temperature is important and pH is also important. So we got nerve, muscle, and then there's stuff in our blood that's available as an energy source. And in blood, we've got glucose, so literally blood sugar that's floating around. So let's say you have fasted for 3 days, your blood glucose is going to be very low, so that's not going to be a great fuel source. But you will start to liberate fats from your adipose tissue, from your fat. Fatty acids will start to mobilize into the bloodstream, and you can burn those for energy. And oxygen in your blood. When you inhale, you're bringing oxygen into your blood. So these are all fuel sources in your neurons, in your muscle, in your blood, in your various tissues that are providing the opportunity to give effort, to induce effort, whether or not it's a run or a swim or writing or talking. Now, there are some other factors that are important, and those are the heart, which is going to move blood. So the more that the heart can move blood and oxygen, well, the more fuel that's going to be available for you to engage in muscular effort and thinking effort. So your heart is vitally important to your muscles' ability to work and your brain's ability to work. And as I mentioned oxygen a few times, it should be obvious then that the lungs are very important. You need to bring oxygen in and distribute it to all these tissues because oxygen is critical for the conversion of carbohydrates and endure long bouts of effort or even moderately long bouts of effort. We need to ask which of those things, nerve, muscle, blood, heart, and lungs, is limiting. Or, put differently, we ask, what should we be doing with our neurons? What should we be doing with our muscles? What should we be doing with our blood? What should we be doing with our heart? And what should we be doing with our lungs that's going to allow us to build endurance for mental and physical work and to be able to go longer, further, with more intensity? That's the real question. How can we do more work? And the way we do that is with energy, and the way to get energy to it is by those 5 things. So now we're going to talk about how you can actually build different types of endurance and what that does at the level of your blood, your heart, your muscles, and your neurons. So we're going to skip back and forth between protocols, tools, and the underlying science. So rather than heavy stack the science at the front end and then just give you all the tools at the end, we're going to talk about the protocols, the 4 kinds of endurance and how to achieve them. And we are going to talk about the underlying science as we move through. If you would like a lot of detailed science, I encourage you to check out a review that we've linked in the show notes. And the review is called Adaptations to Endurance and Strength Training. This is a review article with many excellent citations. It's from Cold Spring Harbor Perspectives in Medicine. The Cold Spring Harbor Press is an excellent scientific press. Spent the last 21 years doing summers at Cold Spring Harbor, the body and the mind. And there are clear longevity benefits. There are a lot of reasons why that's true, but the main one is that if we have good energy utilization in our musculature and in our blood, in our vascular system, and in our oxygenating system, our lungs, the so-called cardiovascular system, respiratory system, and musculature, the body and brain function much better. There are so many papers now, so much data to support that. So I do believe everyone should either try to maintain the muscle that they have, provided they've already gone through puberty and development, and they should be engaged in regular endurance exercise. Now, for many people, they think endurance exercise, that means what? An hour-long run, or I gotta get on the Stairmaster, or I have to treadmill for hours on end each week. It turns out that's not the case. There are 4 kinds of endurance, and you can train specifically for any one of those, and you can vary your training. So let's talk about those 4 kinds of endurance. They're very interesting, and they each have very different protocols that you use in order to build and maximize them. And now you will understand what fuel sources they use in order to build that thing we call endurance. So first of all, we have muscular endurance. Muscular endurance is the ability for our muscles to perform work repeatedly over time for a given set of muscles and neurons. So what's a good protocol to build muscular endurance? Let's just give that to you now and explain some of the underlying science as it follows. So a really good muscular endurance training protocol, according to the scientific literature, would be 3 to 5 sets of anywhere from 12 to 100 repetitions. That's a huge range. Now, 12 to 25 repetitions is going to be more reasonable for most people. And the rest periods are going to be anywhere from 30 to 180 seconds of rest. So anywhere from half a minute to 3 minutes of rest. So this might be 5 sets of push-ups, getting your maximum push-ups. So for some people that might be 0, and you have to do it knees down. For some people it might be 10 push-ups, for some people it might be 25, but you could go all the way up to 100. Rest anywhere from 30 to 180 seconds, and then do your next set for a total of 3 to 5 sets. So it doesn't actually sound like a ton of work. The other thing you could do is something like a plank. A plank position is actually a way to build muscular endurance, not strength. Okay, I'm sure it could be used to. That's the concentric portion of the effort, and then as you lower yourself, that's the eccentric portion. Eccentric portion of resistance training of any kind, whether that's for endurance or for strength, is one of the major causes of soreness. Some people will be more susceptible to this than others, but it does create more damage in muscle fibers. Muscular endurance and building muscular endurance should not include any movements that include major eccentric loads. So if you're going to do push-ups, doesn't mean that you want to drop, smash your chest into the floor. And by the way, your chest should touch the ground on every push-up. That's a real push-up. Okay? It's not about breaking 90 with the elbows. It's about pushing down until your chest touches the floor and straightening out. That's a proper push-up. And a pull-up is where you pull up your chin above the bar. Neither of those should include a slow, eccentric, or lowering component if you are using those to train muscular endurance. It's 3 to 5 sets of 12 to 25 and maybe even up to 100 repetitions with 30 to 180 seconds of rest in between. That means that jumping also is going to be a very poor tool for building muscular endurance, because jumping has a slowing down component as you land. So things like plyometrics or agility work where you're moving from side to side and you're decelerating, you're slowing yourself down a lot, not going to be good for muscular endurance. Terrific. Side, I am guilty of this too. Some of you have actually pointed out, I like to think out of concern, that I often am rubbing my lower back, and indeed I have some asymmetries in my postural muscles, some of which are probably genetic and some of which are probably just from excessive work or something of that sort, that have my right shoulder sit lower than my left and things of that sort. If I wanted to improve those, I could improve those by really focusing on symmetry and isometric. Symmetry meaning holding my hands at equivalent positions in planks and doing isometric holds for building muscular endurance of the postural muscles. But this can also be done with, as I mentioned, kettlebell swings for the lower back and legs and posterior chain. So there are a number of different exercises you could do this with, but it should be compound exercises mainly. It's rare for people to do this kind of muscular endurance work specifically for things like bicep curls or triceps. And there aren't many activities that really rely on isolation of those muscles repeatedly. Right? It's hard. I'm sure there are some out there, but it's going to be hard to imagine. So, you do this with isometrics. You can do this with more standard non-isometric type movements, but make sure there isn't a strong eccentric load. So now let's talk about the science briefly of why this works. Well, that takes us back injured, and while some people can perform those sorts of lifts like snatches, deadlifts, cleans and jerks, and overhead presses, probably not a great idea if the goal is to push the body to points of fatigue, because you do open yourself up to injury unless you're very skilled at doing that or you have a really good coach who can help you guide through those lifts. So that's one form of endurance, which is muscular endurance, and it's mainly going to rely on neural energy, so nerves, and muscle. And it's not going to rely quite so much on what's available in your blood, your heart, or your lungs. So now let's talk about the other extreme of endurance, which is long duration endurance. This is the type that people typically think about when they think about endurance. You're talking about a long run, a long swim, a long bike ride. Well, how long? Well, anywhere from 12 minutes to several hours, or maybe even an entire day, maybe 8 or 9 hours of hiking or running or biking. Some people are actually doing those kind of really long events, marathons, for instance. So anything longer than 12 minutes. And this type of work builds on fuel utilization in the muscles. It builds on the activity of neurons in the brain that are involved in what we call central pattern generators. We talked about this in a previous episode, or several previous episodes. These are groups of neurons that allow our body to engage in regular rhythmic effort without having to think about the movement too much. So running and stepping, or swimming, if you want, the amount of ATP that you can create for a given bout of effort, you're becoming more efficient. Okay, you're burning less fuel overall, doing the same thing. That's really what these long, slow distance or long bouts of effort are really all about. Now, why do this long duration effort? Why would you want to do it? Why is it good for you? Well, it does something very important, which is that it builds the capillary beds within muscles. So let's talk a little bit about vasculature. We haven't done this too much yet, but if you have seen the episode on supercharging performance, we talked about AVAs, these arteriovenous asthmoses, where blood moves from arteries directly into veins, but that's unusual. That only takes place in the so-called glabrous skin of the palms, the face, and the bottoms of the feet. Typically, for most all other areas of the body, what happens is arteries bring blood to a given tissue, like a muscle, and veins return that blood back to the heart. There are exceptions, but in general. And in between arteries and veins are these little tiny, what are called capillary beds or microcapillaries. So these are tiny little avenues, like little tiny streams and estuaries between the bigger arteries and veins. Now, those are actually contained within muscle. And what's amazing is that you can increase the number of them. You can literally build new capillaries. You can create muscular endurance, like planks and everything that we were talking about before, is really about building the capillary systems and the mitochondria, the energy utilization systems within the muscles themselves. And that's very important to understand. It's distinctly different than, say, building the neurons that fire the muscles. The neurons are already there. They're going to fire those muscles just fine. In fact, if your life depended on it today, you could probably run a marathon. You'd probably get injured. It would be very psychologically and physically painful. I don't recommend you do that unless you're trained for it. But if you were to train properly for it, if you were to do long duration bouts of effort once or twice a week or 3 times a week, pretty soon it would become easy because you're building these vascular microbeds or microvascular beds, as they're called. Okay, so you're able to bring more energy to the muscles and they're able to utilize more energy. So that's long duration. So we've got muscular endurance and we've got long duration endurance. And then there are 2 kinds in between that in recent years have gotten a lot of attention and excitement, but most people are not distinguishing between these 2 kinds of endurance. And that's a shame because in failing to distinguish between the 2 kinds of what we call high intensity training, sometimes called high intensity interval training, most people, perhaps you've grasped, so 3 to 1 is just a good example, would be 30 seconds on, 10 seconds off. The opposite extreme on that ratio would be 1 to 5. So 20 seconds on, 100 seconds off. So you do the work for 20 seconds, then you rest 100 seconds. Now, what's the difference? What should you do 3 to 1 ratio, so 30 seconds on, 10 seconds off? Or should you do 1 to 5, 20 seconds on to 100 seconds off? That will depend on whether or not the quality of the movement is important to you. So let's just take a look at the 3 to 1 ratio. So in the 3 to 1 ratio, if you're going to do 30 seconds of hard pedaling on a bike, followed by 10 seconds, so maybe one of these what they call assault bikes, and then you stop for 10 seconds and then repeat, chances are you will be able to do 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe even as many as 12 sets if you're really in good condition, that you'll be able to do all those because pedaling on the bike doesn't require a ton of skill. And if you do it fast, even though it's 20 seconds of intense effort followed by a longer rest of about 100 seconds, will allow you to perform more quality repetitions safely over time. So what does building anaerobic endurance look like? And then I'll tell you what it's actually good for in the true practical sense. What anaerobic endurance exercise generally looks like is that if you decide to do this for the first week, you might do this 2 or 3 times a week, maybe even just once a week, depending on the other things you're doing. We'll talk about programming at the end. And you would generate just 3 sets. So it might be 3 sets of 20 seconds of hard effort, followed by 100 seconds rest. Then you repeat 20 seconds of hard effort, 100 seconds rest, 20 seconds of effort, 100 seconds rest. You might do that twice a week, and then each week you're adding 1 or 2 sets. Okay? In doing that, you will build up what we call anaerobic endurance. What is anaerobic endurance? Well, let's ask why we fail. Anaerobic endurance is going to be taking your system into greater than 100% of your VO2 max. It's going to be taking your heart rate through and repeating another set safely, of course. What you're doing is you are training the neurons to be able to access more energy, literally, convert that into ATP, and for the muscles, therefore, to access more energy in ATP. And the adaptation is in the mitochondria's ability to use oxygen, and this has tremendous carryover effects for other types of exercise. So while I know and appreciate that people are using high-intensity interval training of this kind or similar in order to just like burn fat, do their workouts, quote unquote, it's very useful for building a capacity to engage in short bouts of effort repeatedly, to really lock in, I don't want to use the word focus because it's not strictly mental focus, but to be able to generate short bouts of very intense, then you rest for an equivalent amount of time, then you repeat, and then you rest for an equivalent amount of time. So you might run, first mile is, let's say, 7 minutes, then you rest for 7 minutes. Then you run a mile again, and it might take 8 minutes. You rest for 8 minutes. And you continue that for a total of 4 miles of work, or 4 miles of running work, I should say, or 7 miles of work. You can build this up. Many people find that using this type of training allows them to do things like go run half marathons and marathons, even though prior to the race date, they've never actually run a half marathon or marathon. Now that might seem incredible. It's like, how could it be that running a mile on and then resting for running a mile and then resting for an equivalent amount of time, running a mile, resting for an equivalent amount of time for 7 miles allows you to run continuously for 13 miles or for 26 miles? Well, I'm not discouraging people from ever doing a long duration endurance. I think that is very important. But it's because it builds up so many of these energy utilization systems. It really teaches you to engage, the nerve to muscle firing. It improves ATP, and today can be done. You can program those in the same week, but you want to get 4 and ideally 6 or even better 24 hours between these workouts, because it is very hard, for instance, to do a 1-to-1 mile repeats, like run a mile, rest for equivalent time, run a mile, rest for equivalent time, to do that 2 or 3 times a week and also do weight training before or do a long run afterwards. That would quickly lead to breakdown for most people unless you have very, very good energy utilization systems. You're a really kind of advanced or elite athlete, and or dare I say, you're using tools to enhance your performance at the level of blood or hormones, and I'm actually going to talk about those at the end and why they work. So we have 4 kinds of endurance: muscular endurance, we have long duration endurance, we have high intensity interval training of 2 kinds, anaerobic and aerobic, and this last type, the aerobic one, works best, it seems, if you kind of do this 1-to-1 ratio. So how would you use these and what are they actually doing? Let's talk about the heart and the lungs and oxygen, because that's something that we can all benefit from understanding, because most of those experiments are done in mice or primates, non-human primates, I should say, and it's hard to get mice to do resistance training. Okay? It's hard to get humans to do resistance training. It's definitely hard to get mice to do resistance training. There are ways to do it, but it's hard to get them to do, say, 3 sets of 8 on the deadlift, and then do some curls, and then do some chin-ups, and this kind of thing. Okay, it's pretty easy to get a mouse to run on a treadmill, and you can set the tension on that treadmill to make it so that it's easier or harder for the mouse to turn that wheel. So that's one of the reasons. However, it's very clear, and you should now understand intuitively why kind of standard strength and hypertrophy type workouts are not going to activate the blood oxygenation and the stroke volume increases for the heart that the sorts of training I'm talking about today will. It just doesn't have the same positive effects. Now, that isn't to say that if you just weight train that you'll be dumb or that you'll lose, you're more prone to infections, it's not as efficient, etc. There is a place for mouth breathing, however. It's usually if you need to do a strong exhale, oftentimes you can discard more volume through the mouth unless you're trained at nasal breathing. So if you're doing high intensity training, a good way to conceptualize this is to exhale on the max effort and then to inhale on the less intense part. So that might be as you're generating the movement, your concentric part of the movement, you exhale, right? Just like on a bat swing or something like that, or fighters and martial artists do this differently depending on how they were trained and the different purposes, but they kind of like, or kind of exhaling during the effort and then inhaling on the portion of the repetition that is not the highest effort portion. Usually that's the eccentric phase of anything involving weights or rowing and things of that sort. So nasal breathing is great, but as you increase the intensity of your endurance work, you will need to incorporate the mouth. So a gear system will look something like first gear would be just nasal breathing, or second gear would also be just nasal breathing, or in the first few minutes of endurance work can allow you to breathe more deeply and to deliver more oxygen to the blood and to the muscles, and to be able to do more work more efficiently. So what that involves is sometimes sitting, sometimes standing, and just really concentrating on 2 things. We always hear about how we should diaphragmatic breathe, and that means our belly moves out when we inhale, so our stomach expands, but also expanding the intercostals, which means actually raising the ribs, chest breathing. We're all told that, in yoga class, don't breathe with your chest this, but actually that is warming up the intercostal muscles. So this is also a great way to generate adrenaline if you do it a little bit intensely. So let's say you're feeling unmotivated to train. I don't particularly like doing endurance training until I'm actually doing it. So I benefit from having a practice. So I'll just sit there and for about 3 minutes, I'll just breathe very deeply, trying to raise my chest as much as I can for maybe a minute, and then expanding, contracting my diaphragm and expanding my stomach outward when I inhale. By the end of that, you're actually delivering more oxygen to your system. My lab has looked at this in a totally different context. Andy's lab has looked at it in the context of physical performance. So warming up the breathing muscles should make sense, given that you now know that muscles and neurons need glucose. In terms of endurance type work is hydration. And I think hydration is important for all forms of physical work and exercise, not just endurance. The deal with hydration is that we've been taught about hydration all wrong, but let's remember what neurons work on. What do they use in order to fire? Well, they certainly need water, right? We need water in our system, I should say, but they use electrolytes, sodium and potassium, to generate those action potentials, to actually get neurons to contract, to be able, muscles to contract, and for our brain to function and to be able to think. Typically, we're going, that your pee is actually filtered blood, and they usually kind of go wide-eyed, but then they go, oh, that's kind of cool. Like, kids have this natural curiosity about blood and pee and stuff that's not contaminated by our preconceived notions of those things being gross. Because urine, being filtered blood, can give you some indication as to whether or not you're hydrated enough or not. And in order to really assess that, it's not going to be sufficient to urinate into another volume of water and assess whether or not your urine is very dark or very light. It actually requires urinating into a small volume and saying, well, is it darker or lighter than before? It's not something you really want to do most places. The etiquette of most gyms and environments is not suitable for that. But one of the things that you can just do is you can figure, well, I'm going to lose 1 to 5 pounds of water per hour. You can show up to exercise reasonably hydrated with electrolytes. So potassium, sodium, and magnesium are really key. Yes, it's true, you can die from drinking too much water in particular because fluid initially, and then you're able to take bigger and bigger gulps as time goes on, and pretty soon you're able to drink mid-set, or not mid-set, please don't do that, between sets in your workout or while you're still breathing hard after a mile repeat or something like that, sort of without much disruption or any at all to your performance. Last episode we talked about how to assess recovery and things that you might want to do to improve recovery, how exposure to ice baths and cold showers can reduce inflammation, which can be great for recovery, but can inhibit some of the adaptations for strength and hypertrophy, because inflammation isn't good or bad. Inflammation isn't like a nice person or a mean person, it's both. It's a great thing for stimulating adaptations, but you don't want it around too long, and so we suggested that you not do ice baths within probably 6 hours of any training where the goal was hypertrophy or strength training. There is some evidence that getting yourself into an ice bath or cold shower after endurance training can actually improve the mitochondrial aspects of endurance exercise, that you can get improvements in mitochondrial density, and you can get improvements in mitochondrial respiration, and doing just some slow, pure nasal, long exhale devoted breathing, or lying down and just kind of zoning out. That, it seems, can accelerate recovery and allow you to get back into other types of work, mental work or physical work, more quickly, which makes total sense, because remember, your nervous system and recovery and work is a local phenomenon. Which muscles we're using? You know, are you using your glutes, your hams, and your back, or we're using your shoulders, etc. But it's also a systemic thing. It's also about those neurons in the locus ceruleus that are releasing out, and you quiet all that down after training, and really just zone out. Think of Costello. Channel your inner Costello and just mellow out for 5 to 20 minutes, and then move into the rest of your day. 5 minutes should be manageable, even if it's just sitting in the car with your eyes closed doing that down regulation breathing. I think you'll see big benefits in terms of allowing yourself to come back sooner, do more work over time, and just perform and feel better generally, as well as be able to think about other things besides just how much the previous workout job. A couple more things I think are going to be useful, and I do want to just pack these in because we are closing out the month on physical performance. Visual pacer, because it does allow you to access systems in the brain and body that allow you to create more energy, more effort. And so I find it interesting that I think in a kind of subconscious genius, the race officials and the governing bodies of these races have said, okay, sure, having a pacer there or someone in front you can draft off of them. There's actually a kind of a aerodynamic effect of having someone in front of you that makes it easier to run in the wake of their airstream, so to speak. Same is true in cycling. This is why the cycling teams are so good at maneuvering in packs in very specific ways. You can go faster with less effort if you're drafting, as it's called, behind somebody. But as well, where you place your vision will allow you to generate more effort. And so it's interesting that they've taken out this kind of, if you will, performance-enhancing tool. I imagine, and I have to imagine, that's the appropriate word here, that good runners, good cyclists have the ability to create a kind of pacer in their mind's eye. I have to imagine that they're not just completely allowing their attention to drift, although they do that when they want to be in highly efficient mode, generating effort without having to tax their mental capacity. And remember, mental capacity is neural energy and consumes food and performance. They don't always catch up to that person and win, but having a target, a milestone, is a powerful way that we can generate more force and energy in anything. And the visual system is the way that we bring those milestones into our brain, which then brings about epinephrine, which brings about neural firing, which allows us to access whatever resources happen to be available to us. So I find this fascinating because people often wonder, like, where does the kick come from? Where is this kind of gift of an additional gear? Where is that deeper resource? And we often express it and talk about it in psychological terms, like heart or willpower, or that something kind of got transplanted into us or descended into us. And not to remove any of the spiritual aspects of sport or running or effort or the human heart, but it's very clear that the nervous system, when it's exercised or not, And that changes the way that our entire system, not just our nervous system and our muscular system, but our immune system and the other organs of the body work. So today, as always, we're going to talk a little bit of mechanism. I'm going to explain how neurons control muscle. And then we're going to look at muscle metabolism, how muscle uses energy. I promise to make all of this very simple. I'm actually going to keep it very brief, probably about 10 minutes total. By the end of that 10 minutes, you will understand a lot about the neuromuscular connection, how your brain and nervous system control your muscle, and how those muscles work. Then we are going to talk about how muscles use energy and can change how they use energy for sake of getting stronger, if you like, for also increasing the size, so-called hypertrophy of muscle, and for improving endurance, as well as for improving posture and how you move generally. We will touch on some nutritional themes and how that relates to muscle, in particular, a specific amino acid that if it's available in your bloodstream frequently enough and at sufficient levels can help you. Beautifully illustrated protocol that I didn't illustrate, that's what I beautifully illustrated, at thecoldplunge.com. They've made that protocol for you and they've made it available free of charge for you. So there's no obligation there of any kind financially. You can go to thecoldplunge.com. There's a little tab that says protocols and you can download that protocol. Someone there, I don't know who exactly illustrated it, and you can come away with a PDF of what I described in the previous episode. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of that resource. The other announcement I'd like to make is that many of you have asked how you can help support the podcast, and there's a very straightforward, zero-cost way to do that, and that's to subscribe to our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube, if you're not already there watching this now, hit the subscribe button. That helps us tremendously to get the word out more broadly about the podcast, and we thank you for your support. Most people, when they hear the word muscle, they just think about strength. But of course, muscles are involved in everything that we do. They're involved in speaking, they're involved in sitting and standing up, they're involved in lifting objects, including ourselves. They are absolute experience. But in the neuromuscular system, acetylcholine released from motor neurons is the way, the only way, that muscles can contract. Now, there's another category of neurons in the spinal cord called central pattern generators, or CPGs, and those are involved in rhythmic movements. Anytime we're walking or doing something where we don't have to think about it to do it deliberately, it's just happening reflexively, that's central pattern generators and motor neurons. Anytime we're doing something deliberately, the top-down control, as we call it, from the upper motor neurons comes in and takes control of that system. So it's really simple. You've only got three ingredients. You've got the upper motor neurons, the lower motor neurons, and for rhythmic movements that are reflexive, you've also got the central pattern generators. So it's a terrifically simple system at that level. But what we're going to focus on today is how that system can control muscle in ways that make that system better. Now, when I say better, I want to be very specific. If your goal is to build larger muscles, there's a way to use your nervous system to trigger hypertrophy, to increase the size of those muscles. And it is indeed controlled by the nervous system. So you can forget the idea that the muscles have memory or that muscles grow in response to something. We can all feel blessed that we have this system. And today I'm going to teach you how to use that system toward particular endpoints. So if we decide that we are going to direct our muscles in some particular movement of any kind, whether or not it's a weightlifting exercise or whether it's a yoga movement or simply picking up and putting down a pin, we are engaging flexors and extensors. And our body is covered with flexors and extensors all over. So for instance, our bicep is a flexor and our tricep is an extensor. Those are what are called antagonistic muscles. They move the limbs in opposite directions. So if you bring your wrist closer to your shoulder, that's flexion using your bicep. If you move your wrist further away from your shoulder, that's extension using your tricep. And without getting into a lot of detail, the way that the nerves and brain are wired up to muscle make it such that when a flexor is activated, when the nerve dumps chemical, acetylcholine, onto the muscle to activate the biceps, the triceps is inhibited. So glycogen are broken down into pyruvate. you get a little bit of energy from that. And when I say energy, I mean the ability to move. It's fuel, it literally just gets burned up. But if there's oxygen available, and that's key, then within the mitochondria you can create 28 to 30 ATP, which is a lot of ATP. Now, what does this mean? This means that movement of muscle is metabolically expensive. And indeed, compared to other tissues, compared to fat, compared to bone, compared to almost all other tissues except brain tissue, muscle is the most metabolically demanding, which is why people who have more muscle relative to adipose tissue, to fat, they can eat more and they're more of a furnace. They just kind of burn that up. Okay? So even if you didn't understand anything that I just said, what you probably did hear, and that I hope you heard, is that lactate, what most people call lactic acid. Again, we don't like lactic acid. Lactate is there to buffer that, to reduce the amount of burn. So most people have this exactly backwards. So when you feel that burn, that is not lactic acid. That is lactate that's present to suppress the burn, to suppress acidity. It's also a fuel. When you feel that burn, lactate is shuttled to those areas of the muscle, and there's an actual fuel burning process where in the absence of oxygen, you can continue to generate muscular contractions. Now this is informative because it also tells us that that burning, that acidity that we feel, can inhibit the way that our muscles work, but that lactate comes in and allows our muscles to continue to function. So we'll talk a little bit more about what this whole lactate thing and the burn means, but it's a really important process, and it's amazing to me that most people understand it in exactly the incorrect way. They think, oh, lactic acid is bad, and the deep inhales and try and bring more oxygen into your system. It's definitely not a time to hold your breath. And if ever you've run to the point of feeling the burn, and then you were exercising in any way on the treadmill or on the bike or whatever, and felt that burn, and then you held your breath, it feels much more intense. By breathing, you bring lactate to the site, and you are able to allow lactate to act more as a buffer, a fuel, and a hormonal signal. And the reason I brought this up today is because, as I mentioned, so many people are interested in using exercise, not just for sake of improving physical health and well-being and performance, but also for enhancing their brain. And there are a lot of data out there speaking to the findings that, exercise of various kinds can increase neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons. Well, the unfortunate news is that while that's true in mice, there is very little evidence for enhanced neurogenesis from exercise or otherwise in humans. There's a little bit, and there are a few sites within the brain, such as the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, which may be involved in the formation of new memories. But to be clear, the dentate gyrus is definitely involved in the formation of new memories. Whether or not the new neurons that are added there in humans are involved in new memories is, the evidence for that is weak at best, frankly. I don't think it'd be good for performance either. It's only about 10% of your total effort in any one exercise bout that's going to give you this positive. So now you know how to devote a small portion of your exercise, 10%, in order for muscle and lactate to benefit other tissues, namely your heart, your liver, and your brain. I'd now like to shift our attention to how to use specific aspects of muscular contraction to improve muscle hypertrophy, muscle growth, as well as improving muscle strength. There are a lot of reasons to want to get stronger, and I should just mention that it's not always the case that getting stronger involves muscles getting bigger. There are ways for muscles to get stronger without getting bigger. However, increasing the size of a muscle almost inevitably increases the strength of that muscle, at least to some degree. Reasons why most everyone should want to get their muscles stronger is that muscles are generally getting progressively weaker across the lifespan. So when I say getting stronger, it's not necessarily about being able to move increasing amounts of weight in the gym, and that process of recruiting more neurons, more lower motor neurons, as you recall from the beginning of the episode, these lower motor neurons are in our spinal cord, and they actually dump a chemical, acetylcholine, on muscle, cause the muscles to contract. As you recruit more and more of these motor units, these connections between these lower motor neurons and muscle, that's when you start to get changes in the muscle. That's when you open the gate for the potential for the muscles to get stronger and to get larger, if that's what your goal is. And so the way this process works has been badly misunderstood in the kind of online literature of weight training and bodybuilding and sports physiology. The Henneman size principle is kind of a foundational principle within muscle physiology. But many people have come to interpret it by saying that the way to recruit high threshold motor units, the ones that are hard to get to, is to just use heavy weights. And that's actually not the case. As we'll talk about, the research supports that weights in a very large range of sort of percentage of your maximum, anywhere from 30 to 80%. So weights that are not very light, but are moderately light to heavy, can cause changes in the connections between nerve and muscle that lead to muscle strength and muscle hypertrophy. Put differently, heavy weights can help to do that. That's not the purpose of today's conversation. If you're interested in that, as well as a lot of the other information that I'm going to discuss in more detail, I highly encourage you to check out the YouTube channel and the writings of Dr. Andy Galpin. He's a PhD and a full professor in exercise physiology. He's extremely knowledgeable in this entire area of science-based tools for hypertrophy, how strength and hypertrophy really work. His lab does everything from biopsy on muscles, working with athletes and typical folks as well. A lot of the information that you're going to hear from me in the next 15 minutes or so comes from an extensive exploration of the work that he and his colleagues have done, as well as folks like Brad Schoenfield, another academic who's superb in this whole space of muscle physiology, and from a lengthy conversation that I had with Andy, with Dr. Galpin, prior to this episode. So if we want to think about muscle hypertrophy, we have to ask, what is changing when muscles get larger or stronger? And there are really just three ways that muscles can be stimulated to change. So let's review those three ways and talk about what happens inside the muscle. So there are three major stimuli for changing the way that muscle works and making muscles stronger, larger, or better in some way. And those are stress, tension, and damage. Those three things don't necessarily all have to be present, but stress of some kind has to exist. Something has to be different in the way that the nerve communicates with the muscle and the way that the muscle contracts or performs that makes the muscle need to change. So this is very reminiscent of neuroplasticity in the brain. Something needs to, everybody has imbalances in how muscles can grow, how well muscles can grow, or how poorly or how challenging it is for the muscles to grow. Now, many people who are afraid of getting too bulky, for instance, are afraid of lifting weights. But I think the research shows now that everyone of pretty much every age should be doing some sort of resistance exercise, even if that's body weight exercises, in order to offset this age-related decline in muscle contractile ability, muscle strength, etc., improve bone density. There's nothing good about getting frail and weak over time. And people who invest the effort into doing resistance exercises of some kind, whether or not it's with bands or with weights or with body weight, really benefit tremendously at a whole body level, at a systemic level, as well as in terms of muscle strength. There is a good predictor of how well or how efficient you will be in building the strength and, or if you like, the size of an muscle. And it has everything to do with those upper motor neurons that are involved in deliberate control of the muscle. You can actually do this test right now. You can just kind of march without moving your elbow back behind your body. If you can do that mentally, or you can do that physical movement of moving your elbow back behind your body, you can contract that muscle hard, chances are that you have the capacity to enhance the strength and or size of that particular muscle because you have the neural control of that muscle. This is a key feature of the neuromuscular system to appreciate as we begin to talk more about specific protocols. Because everything about muscle hypertrophy, about stimulating muscle growth, is about generating isolated contractions, about challenging specific muscles in a very unnatural way. Whereas with strength, it's about using musculature as a system, moving weights, moving resistance, moving the body. The specific goal of hypertrophy is to isolate specific nerve to muscle pathways so that you stimulate the chemical and signaling transduction events in muscles so that those muscles respond by getting larger. So there's a clinical distinction between getting stronger versus, especially to the folks that have spent a lot of time in the gym aimed at getting hypertrophy. But I think most people don't appreciate that it's the nerve to muscle connections and the distinction between isolating nerve to muscle connections versus distributing the work of nerve to muscle connections. That's vital in determining whether or not you generate hypertrophy, isolating nerve to muscle contractions, versus strength and offsetting strength loss, which would be distributed nerve to muscle connections. If ever there was an area of practical science that was very confused, very controversial, and almost combative at times, it would be this issue of how best to train. This was the only thing that's been more barbed wire of a conversation, and that is how best to eat. This would be the two most common areas of online battle. And the scientific literature has a lot to say about both of those things. Again, my sources for what I'm about to tell you are Professor Andy Galpin and colleagues. There are other excellent people out there in the field. I really trust his work. He does very controlled studies. He spends a lot of time in this space. What's really exciting is that in just the last 3 years or so, there's been a tremendous amount of information to come out about the practical steps that we can take in order to maximize the benefits of resistance exercise, which maximum of 40% or 50%, and doing many more repetitions, of course. Then you are biasing towards hypertrophy, what some people like to call muscle endurance. But that's a little bit because endurance is always the as related to running or swimming. So 30 to 80% of one repetition maximums doesn't really seem to matter for sake of hypertrophy, except at the far ends where you can bias or strength. Now, it is clear, however, that one needs to perform those sets to failure where you can't perform another repetition with form again or near to failure. And there's all sorts of interesting nomenclature that's popping up all over the internet, some of which is scientific, some of which is not scientific, about how you are supposed to perceive how close you were to failure, etc. But there are some very interesting principles that relate to how the nerves connect to the muscles that strongly predict whether or not this exercise will be beneficial. So here's how it goes. For individuals that are untrained, meaning they can do resistance exercise for anywhere from 0, probably out to about 2 years, or for some people it might be 0 to 1 year. But those are the so-called beginners. They're sort of untrained. For those people, the key parameter seems to be to perform enough sets of a given exercise per muscle per week. The same is also true for people that have been training for 1 or 2 years. What differs is how many sets you perform, depending on whether or not you're trained or untrained. So let's say you're somebody who's been doing some resistance exercise about recovery both at the systemic level and at the local level, nerve, muscle, and local muscle level. We'll talk about that in about 10 minutes when we talk about recovery. I do want to mention something very important, which is that everything I'm referring to here, it has to do with full range of motion. Okay? And you might ask, well, what about the speeds of movements? This actually turns out to be a really interesting data set. For generating explosiveness and speed, so for sprinters or throwing sports, for people that want to generate a lot of jumping, it doesn't appear that learning to move weights as fast as you safely can, especially under moderate to heavy loads, can increase explosiveness and speed. And most of it is from changes in the neurons. It's not from changes in the muscle, it's from changes in the way that the upper motor neurons communicate with the lower motor neurons and generating a pathway, a neural circuit as we call it, that is very efficient at generating matching potentials, which are the electricity with the neurons to trigger the muscle. Now, of course, there are events that happen in the muscle, but the takeaway from that enormous literature is that if you want to get faster, yes, it can be beneficial to get stronger, but if you want to dedicate resistance training specifically to jumping higher, to running faster, to versus quickly, and can move heavy or moderately heavy loads quickly is going to be beneficial because of the way that you train the motor neurons. And of course, changes in muscle. But this could look different for different sports. And obviously, you want to make safety paramount. If you're injured, you're not going to train at all in sport, that is. And so what this would involve is something like 60 to 75% of the one repetition maximum, and then in a controlled way, moving that as quickly as one can throughout the entire set. And certainly not going to failure, because as you approach failure, the ability to move to perform, you're really inevitably slows down. In fact, there are a lot of new technologies now that are focused on informing people of how quickly the bar or weight is moving. I saw an advertisement for this the other day. There are things that people can attach to bars that will literally speak to you as you're doing a set and inform you whether or not you're moving 4 times more slowly per rep than you were at the beginning, and trying to hone in on the exact speed of movement. In talking to these experts prior to this episode, it does appear that for sake of hypertrophy, as long as you're not moving the muscles so quickly that you start to distribute effort to lots of other muscles, it doesn't really matter. Because as the set gets harder, the motor units that you recruit will increase, the number of neurons that you recruit, and the number of muscle fibers, in particular these high threshold band stimulating that muscle. And there are some other things that can enhance the process of building nerve to muscle connections, making it more efficient for generating more strength and hypertrophy. One of them, I owe to say, I was told, is in between set contractions. Another name for this is the people in the gym, guys in the gym, flexing their muscles in between sets. And indeed, the research supports the fact that contractions of about 30 seconds in between the actual work sets, they're not going to favor better performance on the work sets. If anything, they're going to compromise them. But those hard contractions in between sets, for a variety of reasons related to local muscle metabolism, as well as what we talked about before, which are stress, tension, and damage, they seem to improve stress, tension, and damage, and the nerve to muscle contraction in ways that facilitate hypertrophy. In other words, I do reasons. And that involved doing 6 sets of 10 repetitions, even if it requires lightening the weight on one set to the next, with about 2 minutes, 120 seconds rest in between sets, which, if you think about it, is a pretty short rest and is pretty darn hard work. Now, what's interesting is that there's a very limited threshold for increasing testosterone. That protocol of 6 sets of 10 repetitions led to big increases in serum testosterone. But if people did 10 sets of 10, so just 4 more repetitions per set, then testosterone did not increase. In fact, it got more of this catabolic get other benefits from this so-called 10 sets of 10 protocol, but not the testosterone increase and maybe even reductions in testosterone. But it's important to point out that that 6 sets of 10 was done with big compound movements, things like squats or deadlifts or chin-ups or things of that sort. And those were done as single sessions, not in concert with a bunch of other exercise. Although, if athletes are doing that, there's no reason why they couldn't also do other types of training elsewhere. I asked Duncan about this, and he mentioned that done twice a week is probably the maximum amount that anyone could do.
hopefully that disappointment now. Looking forward to what we have in store today, and I'm really positive for everybody to see the boys, everybody, and obviously this now, and enjoy it.
Yeah, it certainly sounds so very, very sad. Lots of countries, but also in the Scotland dressing room. What a night, I imagine.
It was, we enjoyed it. Concentrate on that, but I think it was something for the boys this week, especially what we achieved.
Yeah, Darren, every time anybody ever speaks to you, you know how much it means for you to put that shirt on for Scotland. But this might not have happened during your career, but just to be here now and see this group of players get here, it's pretty special all the same, isn't it?
Oh, no, no, listen, I give it everything I'm trying to do in Scotland. It didn't happen for me. These lads were good enough and went out there and did it and made the nation proud. So,
Great atmosphere in the stadium. Fantastic to have the Untitled Chapter back. Scotland, I'm sure they're going to make a hell of a noise.
Let's talk about the team that will line up here at Hampden this afternoon. No Kieran Tierney, that's obviously a huge blow. What's the situation there?
I'm Kieran Pike, I'm a little wriggle through the wicket training, so not ready for this one. Hopefully,
In terms of the team selection, I know it's been a huge headache for you. Many dilemmas. In terms of up front, you've got Lyndon Dykes, one up front. He's in ahead of Jay Adams. What was your thinking along those lines?
I think looking back at the year we're going to get last year, London was a very, very influential game. Gives us a good target out front. Kevin Ryan were excellent when we played with Serbia, and we deserve the chance to play here again.
It's just too noisy here at Hampden.
It's fantastic.
Let's just say, we'll let you go. The best of luck today.
Thanks very much, thank you. Bristol City. Jeliska, who plays with Sparta Prague. Watched carefully by Cooper.